we are looking at the ninth commandment that talks about not bearing false witness, and I've used several weeks to kind of talk about some of the relationships between the Jewish justice system and some of the aspects of that we see in our modern justice system. And one point I would make as we go through this is that our justice system is not only influenced by, in terms of ancient systems, not only by the Jewish system, but also by the Code of Hammurabi and a couple of other older justice systems that had some of the similar provisions that we're looking at here in terms of resolving civil disputes and some of those kinds of things. Places where we see a real difference are some of the ones that we've specifically looked at, like the one we're going to look at starting off today about justice, like the ones that we have I generally find it's better just wait until my students are done talking.
I don't know, we don't have internet here.
Oh, he needs to do something.
One thing bad about having a phone is internet.
Yeah. No.
Okay, so some of the passages that we see, particularly that talk about things like perjury and the consequences for perjury, are something that are relatively unique to the scriptures in terms of the penalty of perjury being whatever the consequence would. Am I going to have to stop again for you guys?
Really?
Troublemaker!
Now, see, I don't have anybody in my regular classes that does that. That would be okay.
Sorry.
Remember that I hear better than probably any of you in here do, so I can usually hear what you're saying all the way up here, whether you intend for me to or not. So, okay.
At least it was clean.
That's true, and I'm grateful for that, because that would have been an awkward place to have started the Bible class. Okay, so when we talk about the law of Moses, where we particularly see it being somewhat divergent, is that it unilaterally, or rather uniformly, calls on the relationship between God and his people as the enabling authorization for the law. One of the challenges that we find in today's legal system is how to justify or rationalize the authorities that we have given our legal system. If there is not an accepted principle of some sort of moral principle that is higher than simply what we as a people could come up with, then the law becomes very problematic, because we don't have a clear mandate to do the things that we do. If the best we can say is, hey, most of the people, or the majority of the people are in favor of this, that's a pretty, I mean, even though that is the underpinning of the democratic system, that is actually a fairly weak place to proceed with executing someone from, for example. Well, more than half the people in our society thought it'd be okay to kill you. Well, that's great. What if more than half of the people in our society decided to change that rule and make it real easy for you to kill me? Would that be okay? It's problematic from that standpoint. And so one of the things that the Jewish law does in a way that very few other laws have done historically is to specifically associate the authorities given under that law to God. And so there's no question where the moral authority to punish or to try someone or any of that stuff, where that comes from. Did I see your hand, Steve? Okay.
No.
Okay.
You probably felt it about.
It's working its way up here. So. Okay, so in that context, let's...
I do have a question.
Sure.
You said something that's relatively disturbing. What actually does underpin our law and approach to it? If it's not a moral code, which obviously it's not.
Well, it's not. So it's not a moral. So okay, it's a moral code. The question is, what underpins the moral code? What? So if it isn't a divine authority, which the Declaration of Independence makes a call towards divine authority when it says that they're endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and so then it's saying we have these rights because God gave them to us. Now you could argue with that, factually speaking, but forget that. The point is that they make a call. They make a claim towards the Creator. Now that is the last major American document to claim the authority of God as the reason why it's justified. The Constitution doesn't talk about God at all. And so it talks about creating a more perfect union and things like that. So nobody, I can tell you that 25 years ago, more than 25 years ago, I sat around with a group of some of the smartest lawyers in training at the University of Arizona, as I was one of those lawyers, and tried to come up with a statement about what it is that underpins our law. And other than the fact that many of them, because they were very, very secular in their outlook, could not accept the principle that it was some sort of, that moral authority derived from God, no one could really come up with a definitive statement other than the idea that it is basically based on the culture and morality of the system that we find ourselves in. And they're real hesitant to say the culture and morality of whatever system you find yourself in. Because if you say that, then what you're saying is that what happened in Nazi Germany is okay because, the culture and the majority of people supported or went along with it, And so the problem we have, and increasingly this is a problem for us just in a broader sense, is it's very difficult for you if you don't have any kind of higher authority than just what your country does. It's very difficult to look at what another country does and say, you shouldn't do that. Because, well, that's for you, but for us, we can do what we want to do, And the problem is that mindset of you can do what you want to do and I'll do what I want to do is increasingly pervasive in our society and increasingly undermines our ability to actually say to someone else what you're doing is wrong. And you can see this in a lot of the more recent dialogue when it comes to Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, the war that Israel is currently prosecuting, where in both cases you have people in this country who are basically kind of saying, look, it's not our problem and it's not our rules, they can do what they want to do and we should do our own stuff. Or in the case of Israel and Hamas, interestingly, a lot of those same people are saying, it isn't right. They shouldn't be able to do this because of the destruction and the loss of life that they're having. And why we have that divergence is hard to explain, although one argument you could make is that neither Ukraine nor the Soviet Union, Russia, have historically been followers of kind of a democratic system and democratic rules, whereas Israel has been a follower of democratic rules. And so it's a little bit easier. It's kind of like having a conversation, if you're having a conversation about the Bible with someone who's like a Baptist who believes in the Bible versus having a conversation about the Bible with someone who is a Muslim. One of them, you feel like there's some rules that you can expect the other person to follow. The other one, you can't. And I think that may be the distinction there. But the point of all this is there is no really good, that I'm aware of, no really good modern articulation of what the actual authority for our laws is, other than that we have a system that is designed, number one, to generally uphold the will of the majority, and number two, to keep the will of the majority in check so that it doesn't get completely out of control. That's the best argument we come up with, is we've got a system that does that better than anybody else's system. And that's kind of a weak argument when you get right down to it. But it is, and unfortunately, it is susceptible to many of the same things that have caused other democracies to collapse over the years, which is you put enough pressure on that second, either of those two parts. You either put too much pressure on whether you need the majority of the people to do something to make it happen, or you put a lot of pressure on keeping the majority in check, and you can have a situation where very quickly your institutions become part of the process of running away from democracy. So it's not a great scenario, and it is one of the great weaknesses of democracies that were identified by even back during the time of our founding fathers. If you read some of the things that Franklin wrote, Jefferson wrote, Madison, and Alexis de Tocqueville, who wasn't one of the founding fathers, but was the French guy who came over, was looking at what we were doing and kind of admiring it and critiquing it all at the same time. They all said similar things, that the system works, but it only works up to a certain point, and in particular it starts to fall apart when the people that make up the constituency of the system stop putting the interests of the country ahead of their own interests. So once you do that, and once you stop being moral in your outlook, you start to have a problem, and history has shown that they were dead on right about that. So, okay, so one of the things that definitely contributes to that, though, is what we're looking at up here. Isn't that a nice segue? Anyway, is what we're thinking is we're looking up here, which is one of the things that is critical. One of the institutions that is critical to keeping our democracy in check and keeping it on track is having a court system that does operate honestly and legitimately, and that requires evidence and rules to be followed in order to succeed. And so in Exodus 23, we have this commandment that says, or command from God that says, "You shall not pervert the justice due your needy brother in a dispute. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent or the righteous, for I will not acquit the guilty. You shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of the just." I don't know how many of you paid attention to this. Just 2 weeks ago now, there was a trial that began. It was the first major trial of people who were engaged in what looks like systemic fraud during the COVID-19 pandemic. And there was a group that was set up that took in several hundreds of millions of dollars worth of COVID relief funds and basically just appropriated them and used them for their own purposes. And I think 7 different defendants were brought to trial for having been involved in the conspiracy and a variety of other things. And right before that trial was set to start, one of the jurors who was not home, but her family member was, somebody came and knocked on the door and handed them a bag to, it was one of the nicer shopping stores around the country, and basically $125,000 that they were offering her as a bribe to derail the jury from actually finding the defendants guilty. Now, she, as soon as she got home, to her credit, immediately reported that to the prosecution and law enforcement, and they dismissed her from the jury, which is entirely proper. There's no way you could not do that. And then they took steps to investigate what had happened, make sure none of the other jurors had received bribes. But one of the most blatant cases of jury bribery that I've ever heard of, and it helps that the juror actually admitted it, which turned them in. But still, ultimately, of those defendants, like 4 of them were charged with bribery as a result of this particular event. And the irony is that 2 of them were found not guilty in the trial anyway. So now they're going on trial for perjury, not for perjury, for bribery. And under the circumstances, the bribery charge is as serious in terms of prison time as any of the charges they were facing under the original indictment. So not a great plan. But the notion of bribery is one that should make all of us very scared. When you look throughout the history of our country at some of the worst scandals and some of the most problematic behaviors, they have been in situations where, whether it was money or some kind of quid pro quo or whatever it was, there was some kind of illicit transaction taking place to get people to do something different than what they would have done. And it has derailed the administrations of a number of really pretty capable presidents who otherwise probably would have been remembered a lot better. Grant is one of them. After the Civil War, he was elected president. It was expected that he would bring a level of competency and honor to the job because he himself was a highly competent general and a very honorable man. Turned out, though, the problem was he was a competent general, not a competent president, and he really didn't have much of an idea what was going on in his own government. And while he was personally above reproach, he brought a bunch of people to Washington with him who were just taking money left and right. At one point, somebody within the Grant administration actually tried to sell off the nation's strategic oil reserves to private companies in order to personally enrich themselves. And had the courts not stepped in and reversed the deal, we would have actually basically given away one of our largest strategic oil reserves that the U.S. has. So there's been just a history of those kinds of things. And when those things happen, they undermine the trust of the people in the government, they undermine the functioning of the government, and they create outcomes that are not what should happen. And this is exactly what God is talking about here. When you take a bribe in the context of the justice system, you create a perversion of justice. Something happens that is not supposed to happen because you are getting people to make a decision based on the money you've given them rather than on the actual facts of the case. So this is a problem. And then more broadly, he talks about not perverting the justice due to your needy brother. Now, what does it mean? What do you think he means when he's talking about the needy brother?
Mine says to the poor.
Okay, so one interpretation of that would be to someone who is poor. And I've seen that particular interpretation quite a bit, and I think that's accurate, but I think it is limiting. What else could needy brother mean in this context?
Well, if you had an individual that was innocent and you're lying about it, making him guilty, then he's a needy brother.
Okay, exactly. When you're in front of a court and the consequences can be severe, then there's a need that's there. And if the court, or if something unjust is happening, he is being impoverished with respect to justice, just as surely as a brother who doesn't have a lot of money is impoverished from a financial standpoint. So it's really important that the courts, in this case, the Jewish courts, the Israelite courts, that they make sure that justice is done evenly and justice is done consistently. And in particular, it says, make sure you stay far away from a false charge. You don't want any part of taking somebody to court for a false charge or finding them guilty for a false charge. You don't want any part of executing innocent or righteous men, and because God says, I will not acquit the guilty. So there's a trial court here, and there's a trial court up there, and while the trial courts down here don't always get it right, the one up there always does. And if you pervert justice down here, you can expect to have justice done in heaven, and you may not like that justice after what you've done down here. So this is a pretty serious situation. Now, one of the things, and I know we get, and rightly so, our court system gets a lot of bad press, I guess, for lack of a better term. And there's a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which is just the fact of how slow it works and how often it seems like it either gets it wrong, or if you've got enough money or power, you could stay out of trouble. One thing that our court system does is it does hold in check the tendency that our public officials in particular have to lie in public. So one of the fascinating things to watch is the difference between what people will say if they're lawyers, certainly if they're politicians, what they will say in public, and what they will say when they're in court. And there's a reason for that, because in public there are no actual penalties other than, I guess, if people start distrusting you enough, they'll stop voting for you, but there are no direct penalties for lying to the public as long as you're doing it in the context of a press conference or a speech or a campaign event or whatever it is. But if you go into court and you lie in court, there are consequences. There's perjury charges. If you're an attorney and you bring charges that you know you don't have the evidence to support, there are ethics charges and stuff like that. So if you want to know whether someone really has the evidence that they say they do, if you want to know whether someone is legitimately telling you the truth when they're speaking publicly, and for that matter, even saying what they themselves believe, look at what they say when they're in court. And if there's a difference between the two of them, believe what they say in court ahead of what they say in public, because one of those two places, there's consequences. And our court system does do a pretty good job of figuring out what's true and what isn't true by forcing both sides to actually present evidence. You can't just go into court and say, here's what I think, or here's what I say. You have to be able to show, here's what I say and here's the reason why. If you don't have a reason why, then you're going to get laughed out of court at your best. That's the best case scenario. So the court system does have its place, and among the Israelites, there shouldn't be that other element of somebody lying to them in public anyway, but the court system still exists to determine what really did happen and to create penalties for what happened. So let's look over at Isaiah, because it talks a little bit more broadly about the system itself. He says, woe to those who enact evil statutes, and to those who constantly record unjust decisions, so as to deprive the needy of justice and rob the poor of my people of their rights, so that widows may be their spoil and that they may plunder the orphans. Now what will you do in the day of judgment and in the devastation which will come from afar? To whom will you flee for help, and where will you leave your wealth? I find this really interesting in the context of what we see in our modern society, where it isn't just that we have a court system that you can maybe sometimes, you can use money or power to get a good result from. What we see more and more is the degree to which our Congress, our local legislatures are manipulating the law to favor specific groups. whether it's the wealthy or whether it's particular political groups, there is this tendency to enact statutes that benefit limited constituencies, oftentimes at the cost of the ones who are the majority, or the ones who are needy or poor, because money talks. Now, I don't think that most of our congressmen are taking bribes exactly. They're not profiting in the sense that they're not pocketing hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars from people that are bribing them. But how does money affect our political system? How does it become something that drives the decision making?
Money is powerful and money does reign in a certain way.
Okay, you stated the problem, but I want to know why. What does money, assuming that you can't, because legally speaking, if I were a congressman, you can't just give me $125,000 and say, here's how I want you to vote on this. That's called bribery, and that's just as illegal as it would have been in that court case. So how does money drive power?
If I'm a big drug company, a Merck or Pfizer or one of those, and I know there's legislation pending that could adversely affect my business, then I'm going to contribute every dollar I can to every political action committee that is available to me to influence politicians who have the ability to vote in my favor.
Okay, so I can't give you money directly, but I can give you money to make sure you stay in office, and that would presumably create some gratitude on your part for that having been done.
But I never said that it did.
Right, no,
I didn't say
definitely
you
not,
had to
definitely
vote my
not.
way.
No, you can't do that.
But I really like you, I want you to stay in office.
And I need you to understand how important it is that you vote this way versus that way, because here's all the reasons why, yeah.
And one of those reasons why is stock options.
Okay,
That would be a direct benefit, but not directly from the company. If I know that by voting yes, your stock's gonna go up
Okay.
20%.
so if I own stock in a company,
Right.
and now you're talking about something a little different, that's a conflict of interest situation. Now, interestingly, for the most
Very
part,
hard to prove.
our congressmen are required to disclose conflicts of interest, but they're not required to recuse themselves from a vote just because they have a conflict of interest. So that can definitely be a factor. What else? Any other ways that money can become powerful or create power?
And I'm not sure exactly what you're after, but I'll state an example. Lyndon B. Johnson made a tremendous amount of money by escalating the Vietnam War because he had direct interest in defense contracting.
Okay, so, and that's kind of tied to what Jerry's saying. If you have, and when you look at most, that's not universal, when you look at most of the people who serve at the national level politics, most of them are relatively wealthy and have significant investments, in some cases kind of across the spectrum. And so, in general, almost any decision or any particular session of Congress, there are some things that are going to be decided that are going to affect their portfolios, different portfolios for different members, and that can be a profound situation or a profound impact. But there's good.
If I'm a congressman or senator, and I know there's an economic need for my constituency, and I'm interacting with a company that has a choice of where they might build their next plant, if they agree to build it where I want them to, then they have some power over how I might vote.
Towards them, yeah. And so we see this, one of the biggest ones, and this can apply to both congressional members as well as in particular high-level congressional and presidential staffers, is there is this revolving door in government where you work at the highest levels of government, you step away from the highest levels of government, and you go work for somebody who has a job for you that involves lobbying, that involves having contacts. And you get paid a huge amount of money, not so much because you're really good at banking or oil industry or whatever else, because you have contacts and you can get them things that they need. And so what a lot of times happens at the highest levels of government is you have people that go in and out of the government, either elected officials or even more commonly, those upper levels of aides and assistants and stuff like that, who keep shifting in and out of the government. And every time they shift out, they get a huge payday, and they shift back into the government for a while to maintain their contacts, and they shift back out again. And so what happens there, and one of the reasons that can be so problematic is that creates, and as much as I disagree with the characterization that Trump has of this deep state in America, what is true is that trend, that situation where those high-level people are moving in and out, tends to create a level of inertia in the government, because those people have more of an interest in keeping the government moving in a consistent fashion, in spending money, in the way that they fund things, than they do in any particular set of principles. They're not so much, now they'll articulate a set of principles based on who they work for, but their job in terms of what they want for themselves is less about particular principles being honored than it is about making sure that the overall system keeps spending money and keeps moving in the direction that they want it to. And so the problem, unfortunately, is that those people, these are not the people who are the ones who are doing the day-to-day jobs at the EPA and the FBI and whatever else it is. Those people are, for the most part, just professionals doing whatever their job is. It's the really, really high-level stuff, and it's very hard to find somebody who's capable of doing that stuff who isn't plugged into that system. So again, money operates the system, and it becomes very difficult for us to detach ourselves from that. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The single biggest reason for that, ironically, is the growth of the executive department. Since World War II, the executive branch has grown to, I don't even remember what the multiplier is, 80 times, 100 times what it was prior to World War II, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Before World War II, particularly before the Civil War, the entire staff and employees of the executive branch, the presidency, significantly smaller than the number of people who work for Congress. Supreme Court has always had the smallest of all the staffs because of their small numbers, but if you look at the overall federal court system, it would also dwarf the executive branch. But since World War II, the executive branch just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger because most of these most of these departments are part of the executive branch, and so they just have more and more and more members. And the bigger something gets, the harder it gets to understand how it works, and the harder it gets to control what it does. And so there's definitely problems there, and money, unfortunately, has become one of the things that sort of lubricates and operates the system, and we don't have a lot of way of understanding exactly how all that's happening.
What is that saying? Money corrupts, and it corrupts completely.
Actually, it's power, but money is not wrong either.
It's right in that same realm. So once you let that in, you've let the fox in the hen house, because now you've opened this up, and so without getting rid of everything, then there's no way to control it.
It's really hard to control it. Yeah, that's the problem. Is you can't just, well, you can, but it's very impractical, and it doesn't necessarily have very much effect to try to do it bits and pieces here and there. But you also don't want to tear the whole system down, because to tear the whole system down creates anarchy. So you ultimately, over time, and again, this is one of the weaknesses of democracy, is that over time it becomes more and more difficult to control. And again, I'm not trying to criticize democracy and say there's some better alternative that I've come up with out there. I still think it's the best choice. It's just that we have to understand, you always want to understand the weaknesses of your system. You always want to understand what can go wrong, because what's really valuable about understanding your weaknesses? Why is it useful to understand where you're personally?
Prevention and correction.
Exactly. If you don't understand where you're weak, you can't prevent those weaknesses from hurting you. You can't correct those weaknesses, or at least take steps to minimize them. So by understanding the problems of the system, we can take steps, or at least in theory, we can try to take steps to help to prevent it from getting worse than it is. But it's still complicated. And in the case of the Israelites, God wants to set up a system that works from the beginning and has those watch guards and those walls set up ahead of time to prevent it from getting out of control. Now, unfortunately, what we see with the Israelites is the same thing, unfortunately, we see in our society, which is, over time, it starts to break down. It starts to break, actually, it didn't take very much time. It took just, one generation after Joshua for the judges to have to start to come in because of how messed up everything was. The result of the judges is ultimately the institution of the kingship to create control. Prior to the kings, Israel lived in what we would call, what I would almost call a theocratic anarchy. There were no kings, there was no governors, there was a court system, and there were the Levites and the priests who were supposed to tell the people what God wanted and make them follow God's law. But there wasn't anybody around to legislate. There wasn't anybody whose job it was to create the police and all those different kinds of things. It was just each community just kind of did their own thing. And so by and large, the Israelites lived in, or should have lived, in an environment that had about the minimal amount of laws you could have in order to operate. And we make fun sometimes of the 635?
613 laws.
613 laws, but I mean, all you have to do is go into any law library or even any library and look at just the Code of Arizona statutes, and you can see that 613 would be a really nice number to have, you know? They had a relatively small number of rules that they had to follow. We have just almost an infinite number of rules that we have to follow to make our society orderly. And so they couldn't do that. Rather than being able to live relatively freely under God's leadership, they couldn't do that. And so first you have kings, and then after the kings and the nation is sent into captivity, when they come back again, you'd think they would do better, but instead we see in Malachi and other of the minor prophets that they've gone right back to being unjust and unkind and all those kind of things. And so they never really managed to get the hang of what God wanted from them. And so it doesn't seem really no matter what kind of system you have, but the evil of humanity tends to be the common denominator that makes it hard for any governmental system to function properly. Okay, so let's move into the Christian context. And I think it's really important, particularly in an age of Christian nationalism, that we recognize the distinction between what the Bible teaches us about the governmental role of Christianity and what we are oftentimes being told about the governmental role of Christianity. Now, we live in a democracy, which means that you can vote your Christianity, and you absolutely should. But we do not, and we have never been commanded by God to set up a Christian government or to create a Christian nation that is that enforces Christian principles, that requires everyone within it to practice Christianity, that excludes people who are of different beliefs than us. That has simply never been something that the Christian was commanded to do in the Scriptures. Instead, we've been given the job of converting the world to Christ so that people become good and become Christian. The problem with trying to make people be Christian is what?
God gave the right to choose.
Yes.
You have the free will, so everybody does, and we have to accept that.
Yeah. If you try to to overrule free will by forcing people to believe something, the belief isn't real. You know, the Roman Empire under its later stages, when it was a Christian empire, could arguably claim that all of its citizens were Christians. But many of its citizens were not Christians. They were simply Christians in name because they had to be. They didn't believe it. That's not legitimate Christianity any more than baptizing a baby is going to actually do anything for that baby's soul, because they doesn't even know what's going on. It's just getting wet, you know? So we can't try to think that simply because we can make everybody act like a Christian, that means that everybody is actually Christian-like. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't try to pass legislation that makes people act kind towards one another or limits the amount of evil that people can do. That's a different thing. But when we start thinking to ourselves that if we can just get enough people to vote for this, or we can get enough Supreme Court justices to overrule that what we can somehow do is create a nation that is a godly nation, that is a fool's errand, and it will always be a fool's errand. Christianity was designed to operate regardless of what the government looks like, because Christianity is about a kingdom, and it's not about a kingdom here on earth, not a physical kingdom anyway. The kingdom of God is a spiritual concept, and ultimately its expression will be at the end of time after these current physical rules are gone. So we have to understand and recognize that our role is to vote as Christians for what we believe is going to lead our nation in better ways, and in some cases to vote for what we believe is best for our nation, not contradictory to our Christianity, but maybe without necessarily trying to figure out whether it works better or worse than something else. But ultimately our job is to focus on saving people, on bringing the lost to Jesus, not on what our political system looks like, not on what our court system looks like. And so what we start with, though, is making sure that we are acting the way that God wants us to act. And in James has a lot of practical advice for how you live your life. And one of the places he talks about is this idea, the same kind of thing about what bribery does, the same kind of thing about what perverting justice does. He says favoritism does that same kind of thing. He says, do not hold your faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ with an attitude of personal favoritism. If a man comes into your assembly with a gold ring and dressed in fine clothes, and there also comes in a poor man in dirty clothes, and you pay special attention to the one who's wearing the fine clothes and say, you sit here in a good place, and you say to the poor man, you stand over there or sit down by my footstool, have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives? Now, you could say, this isn't as bad as, perverting justice in a court for somebody who's needy, or of bringing false testimony and causing someone to be executed or otherwise punished in a court. And on one level, I would agree with that. But what James is trying to point out is that if our job isn't to be the government of the world, then our job is to be the leadership and the people who are bringing God's will to life within the kingdom, within the church. And how we do that is as much a judgment on our character as how the judges in ancient Israel and the priests in ancient Israel judged cases fairly or unfairly.
You're right in the sense that this type of action is not as egregious for the person who gets executed wrongly. But what's going on here is the same thing Jesus kept saying over and over again. It's a heart condition. It's about your heart. It's about your own personal attitude and relationship with God, and your willingness to recognize that Jesus is Lord, Christ, King, High Priest, the whole bit. And we're supposed to live completely in subjection to Him. And if we don't, then we do this kind of stuff, which has its end result in having the wrong kind of judgmental outcome in our court system.
Yeah, exactly. If your attitude is wrong, the outcome is going to end up being wrong more often than not. One of the things that I think as Christians we have to recognize is that you don't really see in the scriptures, with a few exceptions, and I don't want to get into that right now, but with a few exceptions, you don't really see in the scriptures the notion that the ends justify the means coming up much at all. David was anointed to be king even while Saul was king. At no point did David say, the end justify the means, I'm going to go ahead and kill him and just take over because I've been anointed to do it, so it's the right thing to do. He had the opposite perspective. I've been anointed by God, but I'm going to let God decide when it's time for me to actually take over. And we see this over and over again, that the ends do not justify the means. You can't simply say this is what's best, so we're going to do whatever we have to make it happen. The expectation is that you do the right thing, and the right thing comes out of that. Even if sometimes that right thing is simply showing the world that this is the right way to do it, even though there's consequences. So this is a complicated idea here, but this idea of personal favoritism, of showing somebody more kindness than somebody else because of who they are. One of the things that James says, and I didn't include it in here, is he says, well, it's the rich people that are causing all the problems anyway. They're the ones that are dragging you into court. They're the ones that are getting you in trouble for what you believe. Why in the world do you treat them better than everybody else when they're the ones that are causing those problems? Now, obviously that's a generalization. The guy who came into your assembly to visit with you and worship is probably not one of those guys. But his point is, and this is a weird truth in at least most capitalistic democratic societies as well, which is that even though most people aren't wealthy, we look at the wealthy and we say to ourselves, that's what I want to achieve. They have succeeded, therefore I want to be like them, and I want to make things good because that's what I want. And so when you look in America, historically, we have believed in the idea that you can pick yourself up by your own bootstraps, which is a great analogy because it is literally physically impossible to pick yourself up by your own bootstraps. But we have this idea that if you work hard, you can achieve and you can succeed. And yet, most people never will. Not to the level that we've seen some of the great industrialists or whatever. More concerningly, a lot of the legislation and the choices that have been made in terms of the way that our system is structured make it increasingly impossible for someone to really become truly successful in our world. And yet somehow we still tend to focus on the idea of wealth being something that shows that people are, better somehow, and we tend to be impressed by people who are wealthy, and we tend to be, obsessed in some cases with people who are wealthy, because we have this fascination with things. We've always had a fascination with things, humanity has. And so we get focused on that, and rather than looking at people for what they are, we get focused on what they have, and then we lose sight of what they are, and we treat them badly or well based on what they have instead of who they are. And that's a very dangerous place to be, and as you said, Ken, it's a heart problem that has to be constantly monitored to make sure that we're not applying our Christianity in a way that is abusive or that is distinguishing for unjust reasons. We have to be careful about that. All right, we're going to stop right here because